Jake Reynolds was a man who had always thought of himself as someone who could handle anything life threw at him. He had his share of struggles, no doubt. Recently divorced, living alone in a small apartment, and with a career that no longer excited him, Jake felt like he was slowly drifting through life without any real purpose. He tried to stay busy, but it was hard to shake the loneliness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. One Saturday morning, Jake decided to volunteer at a local shelter. It wasn't anything special. He had never really volunteered before, but he figured it might help him take his mind off things. The shelter was a place where people who were struggling could find food, clothes, and sometimes just a moment of comfort. It wasn't a glamorous place, but it had its own kind of warmth. As Jake walked through the entrance of the shelter, he wasn't sure what to expect. There were a few people milling about, talking quietly or sitting alone. Some of them glanced up at him, but no one paid much attention. Jake wasn't sure why he had thought volunteering here would change anything, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here. He was assigned to help out with the lunch service, serving food to anyone who needed it. It wasn't glamorous, but it was easy enough work. He stood behind the counter, handing out trays of food and smiling when someone looked his way. It wasn't much, but he felt good doing something, anything that might make a difference. It was about an hour into his shift when he noticed her. Sitting alone at a small picnic table outside, a little girl with messy brown hair and bright blue eyes was looking down at the ground, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was so small, her legs barely reaching the edge of the bench. She looked out of place, not like the other children running around or chatting with their families. She seemed quiet, sad. Jake felt a sudden tug in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about her that made him want to go over and talk to her. He wasn't sure why. After all, he didn't know anything about children, and he had never been particularly good with them. But something about the way she sat there alone made him feel like he should be the one to offer her a little company. He walked over slowly, unsure of what to say. When he was close enough, he stopped and smiled. "Hi there," he said gently, trying not to startle her. The girl looked up at him, her big blue eyes staring at him for a moment before she shyly looked down again. She didn't respond right away, and Jake wasn't sure if she would. But he waited, giving her space. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice calm. The girl nodded, but her eyes remained downcast. Jake could tell something was wrong, but he didn't push her to talk. Instead, he took a seat at the edge of the table, keeping a comfortable distance. "I'm Jake," he said, hoping she might speak. "I'm just helping out here today." She glanced at him for a brief moment, and Jake noticed her eyes were filled with a mix of curiosity and caution. It wasn't long before she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Ella," she said, her words soft but clear. "Ella," Jake repeated, smiling. "That's a nice name. How old are you, Ella?" Ella hesitated for a moment before answering. 5, she said quietly. Jake nodded, trying to think of something to say next. It wasn't easy. He had never been good at making conversation with children, but there was something about this little girl that made him want to keep talking, to find a way to make her feel better. "Are you hungry, Ella?" Jake asked after a moment, his eyes scanning the picnic table where a tray of food had been set out. He wasn't sure what she'd had for lunch, but he wanted to offer her something if she hadn't eaten. Ella shook her head. "I already ate," she said softly. "I'm just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Jake asked, his curiosity piqued. "For my dad," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart tightened. There was something in her voice, a sadness that seemed to hang in the air. "Is he coming soon?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though he felt a pang of concern. Ella looked at him for a long moment as though weighing whether or not she should answer. Finally, she shook her head, her eyes downcast once again. "No," she said softly. "He never comes." The words hit Jake like a cold gust of wind. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, but he wasn't sure if he believed that himself. He could see it in her eyes, the quiet acceptance of abandonment, the sadness that no child should have to carry. He sat there, unsure of how to make her feel better. He wanted to do something, anything, to show her that she wasn't truly alone. But all he could do was stay with her, offering his presence in the way he knew best. For a few moments, the two of them sat in silence. Jake didn't know what to say next, and Ella seemed lost in her own thoughts. But the longer he stayed, the more Jake realized that he wasn't just there for her. She was starting to help him too. In her quiet way, she had reminded him of something important. Maybe life didn't always go the way you planned, but sometimes it was enough just to show up. Eventually, Ella looked up at him again. Her eyes were still sad, but there was a faint glimmer of something else, something like trust. "Do you think my dad will ever come?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Jake swallowed hard. He wasn't sure how to answer her, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk away. "I don't know," Jake said softly, "but I'll stay with you until he comes. You're not alone." The words felt like a promise, and in that moment Jake knew his life had changed. There was no turning back now. He had no idea what the future held, but for Ella he would stay. He couldn't walk away. Over the next few weeks, Jake found himself returning to the shelter more often. At first it had been just an attempt to stay busy, to distract himself from the mess that was his life. But now, there was something else pulling him back every time. Ella. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt connected to her in a way he hadn't expected. It was as though she needed him, and in a strange way, he needed her too. Ella was always there when Jake arrived, sitting at the same small picnic table. She wasn't alone anymore. Other children had started joining her and they played together, laughing and running around. But even when the other kids were around, Ella always seemed to keep to herself a little. She smiled, she played, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. At first, Jake had been unsure of how to interact with her. He didn't want to push her to talk, but he also didn't want her to feel like she was invisible. Slowly, though, he learned that sometimes just being there was enough. And every time he showed up, Ella seemed to relax a little more. Her eyes would light up when she saw him, and though she didn't speak much, Jake could tell that she enjoyed his company. One afternoon, as Jake was handing out food to some of the shelter guests, he saw Ella sitting alone again at the picnic table. This time, she wasn't playing with the other children. She was holding something small in her hands. Jake couldn't see exactly what it was, but it looked like a tiny doll. She was looking at it with a serious expression, her lips moving as though she were talking to it. Jake smiled to himself. He didn't want to interrupt her moment, but he couldn't help feeling curious about the little world she had created for herself. He finished his task and walked over to the table, sitting down beside her without saying anything at first. Ella didn't look up. Instead, she continued talking softly to her doll, as though Jake wasn't there. Jake waited, not wanting to force her to speak. He just sat quietly, watching her. After a few minutes, Ella finally glanced at him, her eyes flickering for just a moment before she returned to her doll. "Is that your little friend?" Jake asked gently. Ella nodded but didn't say anything. She simply adjusted the doll in her hands, as though making sure it was comfortable. "What's their name?" Jake asked, smiling. "Lily," Ella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's my friend." Jake leaned forward a little, intrigued. "Lily seems nice," he said. "What does she like to do?" Ella paused, her tiny fingers running over the doll's dress. "She likes to pretend," Ella said after a moment. "She likes to pretend she's not alone." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Jake's heart felt a little heavier. It was clear that Ella wasn't just talking about her doll, she was talking about herself. Jake didn't say anything at first. He didn't want to push her into a conversation she wasn't ready for. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small toy car he had found at the shelter earlier. He slid it over to her. "This is for Lily," Jake said softly. "I thought she might like it." Ella looked at the car for a moment, her eyes wide. She reached out and carefully picked it up, her fingers gently tracing the smooth edges. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but sincere. Jake nodded. "You're welcome. I'm glad Lily has a new toy." For a few minutes they sat in comfortable silence, Ella holding the doll and the toy car. Jake wasn't sure if Ella fully understood how much she had begun to matter to him, but he could feel it in his chest. The way she had started to fill a hole he hadn't even realized was there. He wasn't sure why he had started coming back to the shelter, but now it seemed clear. It wasn't just about helping or passing time. It was about her. It was about the connection he was beginning to feel with this little girl who had been through so much. Later that afternoon, as Jake helped with the cleanup, he overheard a conversation between a couple of the shelter staff. They were talking about Ella, and he couldn't help but listen in. "She's had a rough time," one of the staff members said. "Her mom, well, let's just say she's not exactly stable, and Ella's dad hasn't been around in months." Jake frowned as he heard this. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more real. Ella's life was much harder than he had imagined. No child should have to deal with that kind of uncertainty, with the fear that their parents might not come back. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more for her. He didn't know if he was ready to take on the responsibility of being a father figure, but at that moment he knew he couldn't just walk away. The next day, Jake made an effort to spend more time with Ella. He brought her a small drawing book, hoping it might give her a creative outlet. She was a quiet child, and Jake wondered if she needed something to express herself. When he handed her the book, her face lit up, and for the first time she smiled, a real wide smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice brighter than it had ever been. "You're welcome," Jake said, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. He watched as Ella opened the book and began to draw, her little fingers working carefully, making shapes on the page. For the next few days, Jake and Ella spent more time together. They drew pictures, played simple games, and talked about little things that seemed so insignificant, but somehow made their bond feel stronger. Jake learned that Ella loved animals, and that she dreamed of living in a house with a big garden where she could have a dog. She told him stories about her imaginary friends, and sometimes she would even laugh, a soft, quiet sound that made Jake's heart feel lighter. As the days passed, Jake couldn't help but think about the future. Ella's situation was complicated, and he knew that her life wasn't going to magically get better overnight. But he couldn't ignore the fact that she was starting to trust him. She was looking to him for comfort, for support, and Jake felt a growing sense of responsibility to be there for her. One evening, as Jake was about to leave the shelter, Ella caught him by the sleeve. "Jake," she said, her voice serious, "will you always come back?" Jake knelt down to her level, meeting her gaze. He smiled softly. "I'll always come back, Ella. I promise." And in that moment, Jake knew that he had made a commitment, whether he fully realized it or not. He wasn't just a volunteer at the shelter anymore. He was a part of Ella's life. And no matter what happened, he couldn't walk away. Days turned into weeks, and with every passing day, Jake found himself drawn more deeply into Ella's world. He looked forward to his visits to the shelter, eager to see the little girl who had started to feel like a part of his life. There was something about her, something in the way she looked at him with those big, trusting eyes that made him want to protect her, to make sure she was safe and happy. But as much as Ella had begun to open up to Jake, she still carried a heavy weight on her small shoulders. The other children at the shelter came and went, and while they played together and shared stories, Ella often stayed on the edges of their games, quietly observing rather than joining in. It wasn't that she didn't want to play, it was just that she didn't always know how to. She had learned early on that not everyone stuck around, and the people she loved most seemed to always let her down. Jake had learned more about Ella's situation over the past few weeks. Her mother, a woman named Carla, had struggled with addiction for years. Carla's life had been a series of broken promises, missed opportunities, and painful choices. Ella's father, a man named Mark, hadn't been around in over 6 months. No one knew where he had gone or if he would ever return. Ella's world was full of uncertainty, and Jake could see that she had learned to live with it, even though it tore at him to watch. One day, Jake arrived at the shelter to find an unusual silence hanging in the air. He had gotten used to the normal bustle of the shelter, people talking, children laughing, staff moving about. But today there was an odd stillness. As he entered, he saw a group of shelter workers gathered in the corner, speaking in low voices. Ella was nowhere in sight. His heart skipped a beat as he approached one of the workers, a woman named Sarah. "Is everything okay?" Jake asked, concern flooding his chest. Sarah looked at him, her face pale. "Jake, it's Ella. She's gone." Jake's stomach twisted. "What do you mean she's gone?" "We think she ran away," Sarah explained quietly. "Her mother showed up here this morning. She wasn't in a good state. Ella got upset, and when we turned our backs for just a moment, she was gone. We've been looking for her, but no one's seen her. Jake felt a cold rush of fear sweep over him. He had no idea where Ella could have gone, but he knew that if she was out there alone, she wasn't safe. Without wasting a second, he ran out of the shelter, calling her name. He searched the streets, asking anyone who would listen if they had seen a little girl with brown hair and a pink dress. But the hours passed, and there was no sign of her. Jake felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He had promised to be there for her, to keep her safe. And now she was out there alone. As night fell, Jake returned to the shelter, exhausted and frustrated. He had searched everywhere he could think of, but there was no sign of Ella. He walked inside, feeling like a failure. Sarah and the other staff members had already contacted the police, and they were now working together to spread the word. But deep down, Jake felt like the one person who should have been able to protect Ella had let her down. The next morning, Jake was woken by a call. It was Sarah, and her voice was filled with a mix of relief and concern. "Jake, we found her. Ella's back, but she's not okay." Jake's heart jumped into his throat. "Where is she?" "She's in the office," Sarah said. "She's been crying and she doesn't want to talk to anyone. But she's safe. That's what matters right now." Jake's legs carried him to the office before he even realized it. When he walked in, he saw Ella sitting on a small chair by the window. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her hands were trembling. She looked up at him when he entered, but her expression was distant. She didn't smile, didn't reach out for him like she usually did. It was as though a wall had gone up between them. Jake knelt down in front of her, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. "Ella," he said softly, his voice gentle. "Where did you go? Why did you run away?" Ella didn't respond at first. She just stared at him, her lips pressed tightly together. Jake reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. "Ella," he said again, "I'm not mad. I just want to know what happened." Finally, Ella spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought maybe if I left, my mom would come find me. She always says she'll come back for me, but she never does. I thought if I wasn't here, maybe she'd see that she has to come and get me." Jake's heart shattered at her words. He had never realized how deeply Ella was affected by her mother's broken promises. In her young mind, she thought that if she disappeared, her mother would have no choice but to come after her. It was a heartbreaking thought, one that no child should ever have to carry. "I'm sorry, Ella," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you have to feel like this." Ella didn't say anything, but she looked up at him with eyes full of unshed tears. For the first time, she let herself lean into him, resting her small head against his chest. Jake wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know how to fix everything, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away. "I'm here for you, Ella," Jake whispered, his voice firm but gentle. "I promise. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to be alone anymore." For the first time in a long while, Ella didn't feel alone. She was scared, confused, and hurt. But in that moment, she felt the warmth of someone who truly cared, someone who would be there for her no matter what. Jake held her for a long time, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be many challenges to face. But he also knew that no matter how hard it got, he would never walk away. Not from Ella, not now. The days after Ella's disappearance were some of the hardest Jake had ever experienced. He spent sleepless nights thinking about her, wondering what she was feeling, what she was thinking. The fear he had felt when she was missing still lingered in his chest, and he couldn't shake the image of her small, trembling face when she had returned to the shelter. It was a look he would never forget, a look that said she was lost both physically and emotionally. But in the days that followed, something in Jake began to change. He found himself not only worrying about Ella's safety, but about her future. It wasn't enough for her to just be safe. She needed something more. She needed a place where she could feel secure, where she could feel loved. And slowly, Jake realized that maybe that place could be with him. The thought was terrifying. He wasn't a parent, and he had never imagined himself as one. Sure, he had always wanted a family, but life hadn't turned out the way he expected. His marriage had ended in heartbreak, and his career, once full of promise, now felt like just another job. He had never even considered the idea of raising a child, and yet here he was looking at Ella, a child who had already been through more than anyone her age should ever have to endure. The truth was, Jake didn't know if he was ready. He wasn't sure if he was capable of being the father figure she needed. There were so many unknowns, so many things that could go wrong. What if he failed? What if he wasn't enough? But there was something else, a feeling deep in his gut that he couldn't ignore. It was a feeling that told him no matter how scared he was, he couldn't walk away from Ella. She had already been through too much abandonment in her short life, and the thought of adding to that pain broke his heart. She needed someone, and Jake realized for better or worse he could be that person. He knew it wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just about making the decision to take Ella in. It was about everything that came with it. There would be tough days, difficult conversations, and moments when both of them would question whether they had made the right choice. But Jake had come to understand that parenting wasn't about having all the answers. It was about showing up, being there, and doing the best you could. And if that was all he could offer Ella, then he would give it everything he had. The next morning, Jake made up his mind. He didn't tell anyone yet. He needed to make sure he was truly ready. He took a few hours to think things through, walking around the city trying to clear his mind. But the more he thought, the clearer it became. He couldn't just stand by anymore. He had already started down this path, and now it was time to take the next step. When he arrived back at the shelter, Jake went straight to Sarah, the shelter worker who had been so kind and supportive throughout the past few weeks. He found her in the back office, speaking with some of the other staff members. When she saw him, she smiled, but there was something in her eyes, a concern, a gentle understanding, that told Jake she knew something was on his mind. "Jake, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her tone soft but direct. Jake took a deep breath, his nerves suddenly hitting him all at once. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice steady but unsure. "About Ella. I know she's been through a lot, and I don't want her to go through it alone anymore." Sarah raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I want to take her in," Jake said quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know exactly what that looks like or what kind of father I'll be, but I don't want her to be alone. She needs someone. And I think I can be that someone." Sarah's face softened and she nodded slowly, her eyes full of warmth. "Jake, I think that's a wonderful decision. But I have to be honest with you, this won't be easy. Ella's been through a lot. She'll need time to adjust, and there will be moments when she tests you, when she pushes you away. You have to be ready for that," Jake nodded. "I know, but I'm ready." "I have to be," Sarah smiled, her expression full of understanding. "I think you'll be a great father figure to her, Jake. Just remember, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up." Jake took a deep breath, feeling both relieved and nervous at the same time. It wasn't the kind of decision you made lightly, but in that moment he knew he had made the right choice. He wasn't sure what the future would look like, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking away from Ella. That afternoon, Jake sat down with Ella in the same quiet corner where they had talked so many times before. She was drawing in her sketchbook, her head down, concentrating on the page. When he approached, she looked up, her eyes a little wary but still filled with trust. "Hey, Ella," Jake said gently, sitting down beside her. She gave him a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She had been quiet since her disappearance, still working through the emotions of what had happened. Jake knew it would take time for her to fully open up again, but he was patient. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jake asked, his voice calm and steady. Ella nodded, closing her sketchbook and turning to face him. She didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. "I've been thinking a lot," Jake began, "about everything that's happened and about you. I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here for you. For as long as you need me, I'll be here." Ella's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time in days, Jake saw a flicker of hope in them. "You're not leaving?" Jake shook his head, his voice firm. "No, Ella, I'm not leaving. I promise." Tears welled up in Ella's eyes, and she bit her lip, trying to hold them back. But they came anyway, one by one, falling down her cheeks. For a moment, Jake didn't know what to say. He simply reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. Ella didn't pull away. She melted into his embrace, her small frame trembling with emotion. "I'm going to take care of you, Ella," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not alone anymore. I'll be here every step of the way." And in that moment, Jake knew this was it. This was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. The road ahead would be hard, but it would also be filled with love, healing, and the kind of bond that couldn't be broken. He had made his decision and he wasn't going to walk away. Not now, not ever. The first few weeks after Jake made the decision to take Ella into his home were nothing short of overwhelming. They were both adjusting to a new reality, one where they weren't just strangers in a shelter, but two people trying to build a life together. Jake had always believed that taking care of yourself was the most important thing, but now he realized that wasn't enough. Ella needed more than just physical care. She needed emotional support, stability, and, above all, love. At first, Ella was quiet. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her words were often hesitant, as though she was unsure of how much she could trust him. Jake didn't blame her. She had been through so much, and trust didn't come easily when people had let her down in the past. But every day, Jake worked to prove to her that he wasn't going anywhere. He made small changes to their routine, creating a sense of normalcy. He made breakfast in the mornings, taking extra care to make her favorite pancakes. He helped her with homework, even though he wasn't sure he remembered how to do long division himself. But every time she smiled, every time she looked at him with those trusting eyes, Jake felt more and more like he was doing the right thing. They spent their weekends together, doing simple things that made Ella feel safe. They went to the park, played board games, and even baked cookies one Saturday afternoon, the kitchen filled with the sweet smell of vanilla and chocolate chips. For a brief moment, it was as if everything was perfect. Ella laughed as she attempted to crack an egg, and Jake couldn't help but chuckle at the mess they made. But despite the mess, there was a warmth between them that felt real. It was in those small, everyday moments that Jake began to feel like a father, not just a man looking after a child, but someone who was truly part of her life. Still, things weren't always easy. Ella had moments where she would retreat into herself, staring out the window as though she were waiting for someone who wasn't coming. It broke Jake's heart every time he saw that look in her eyes, the sadness that still clung to her even after all the promises he had made. There were nights when she would lie in bed, hugging her pillow so tightly it seemed like she was trying to hold on to something she couldn't explain. One evening, after Jake had tucked Ella into bed, he sat down at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He was tired, both physically and emotionally. It had been a long day, and he found himself staring at the wall, lost in thought. He loved Ella. He knew he did. But he couldn't shake the nagging fear that he wasn't enough. What if he couldn't give her everything she needed? What if she still missed her mother, still longed for the father who had disappeared from her life? But in the quiet of that moment, Jake reminded himself why he was doing this. He wasn't perfect. No one was. But he was trying. He was showing up every day, giving her a sense of security, and proving to her that she was loved, even when it felt like everything else had let her down. That was enough. That had to be enough. The next morning, Ella came into the kitchen with her hair messy from sleep, her pajamas wrinkled. Jake smiled at her, feeling a warmth in his chest as she walked toward him, rubbing her eyes. He was starting to get used to these little moments. She was still quiet, but she wasn't as distant as she had been in the beginning. "Good morning, sunshine," Jake said, trying to keep his tone light. Ella gave him a small smile, but it was enough to make Jake's heart swell. She didn't say anything at first, but after a moment, she looked up at him. "Jake?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah?" Jake responded, his attention fully on her. Do you think I'll ever see my mom again?" Jake felt a pang of sadness in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't know, Ella," he said gently, "but I do know one thing. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to worry about being alone anymore. I'm here, and I always will be." Ella looked up at him, her big blue eyes searching his face. For a moment, Jake could see the doubt still lingering there. But then something changed. She slowly reached out, her small hand taking his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, Jake knew that she was starting to trust him. She was starting to believe that he was telling the truth. "Okay," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Jake squeezed her hand gently, offering her a soft smile. "Okay," he repeated, his heart lifting. It was a small word, but it meant so much. It meant that Ella was beginning to understand that she wasn't alone anymore. She had him, and that was something that neither of them had ever experienced before. As the weeks went by, Jake and Ella's life together began to feel more like a real family. They had their ups and downs, of course. There were days when Ella would retreat into herself, when she would feel the weight of her past pressing down on her. But there were also moments of pure joy, like when she sang along to her favorite songs in the car, or when she proudly showed Jake her latest drawing. Little by little, Jake started to feel like he was doing this right. He wasn't perfect, but he was enough. One day, after a long week of school and work, Jake and Ella sat on the couch together, eating ice cream and watching a movie. It was one of those simple nights that felt perfect in its own way. As the movie played, Jake glanced over at Ella, who was curled up next to him, her head resting on his shoulder. She looked up at him, her face soft with contentment. "Jake?" she said, breaking the silence. "Yeah? Do you think we could make this our forever home?" she asked, her voice full of hope. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to ask that, but as he looked down at her, he knew that she wasn't just talking about the house. They were talking about their life together. "I think we already have," Jake said, his voice filled with emotion. "This is our home, Ella. Forever." Ella smiled up at him, and in that moment Jake knew that he had made the right choice. It wasn't about being the perfect father. It was about showing up, loving her, and being there through the hard times and the good. And no matter what, they were in this together. And as Jake watched Ella drift off to sleep that night, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, he was the father she had always needed. And she was the daughter he had never known he wanted. Together they had built something beautiful, a family, a future, and a love that would never fade.